You are a priest in the year 1396, standing in the chilly stone halls of Westminster Abbey. Your breath misting in the autumn air as you hold your prayer book. You watch in fascination as servants hurry about, preparing for what courtiers whisper will be the most unusual royal wedding England has ever seen. The bride has arrived from France, a princess, they say, daughter of King Charles himself. You've blessed many marriages, joined countless hands in holy matrimony, but never have you witnessed such a stir at court. When the grand oak doors open and the wedding party enters, your eyes widen in disbelief. The groom, King Richard II, stands tall and regal at 29, his golden hair catching the light streaming through the stained glass windows. Beside him walks what seems to be a child, barely reaching his elbow, her tiny hand completely enveloped by his gloved palm. She cannot be more than 6 or 7, this little princess in her elaborate French gown, her dark hair braided with pearls that seem too heavy for her small head. You steady yourself against the altar rail. This is Isabella of Valois, the new Queen of England. In your lifetime, you've seen brides as young as 12 or 13. Political matches are the norm for noble families. You understand the times you live in. Life is brief and uncertain. The Great Plague swept through just 50 years ago, taking half the population. Kings must secure alliances while they can, and marriages seal treaties more permanently than any document. As the ceremony begins, you watch the child's face. She seems more curious than frightened, her large, dark eyes taking in the grandeur around her, the soaring Gothic arches, the flickering candles, the nobles in their finest silks and velvets. When King Richard speaks his vows, his voice is gentle, almost protective. This is no tyrant taking a child bride for selfish reasons. This is a king fulfilling his duty to his realm, securing peace with France through this sacred bond. The marriage will not be consummated. Everyone understands this. The young queen will be raised and educated at the English court until she comes of age. It is the way things are done. You bless their union with a steady voice, though your heart beats strangely as you pronounce them husband and wife. Watching this tiny girl become Queen of England, you cannot help but wonder what fate awaits her in the perilous game of royal politics. Before diving into these forgotten tales of survival and struggle, if you enjoy uncovering hidden truths of history, consider hitting the like button and subscribing for more content like this. And please, comment below to let me know where you're listening from. I find it incredible that we're exploring these ancient stories together from different parts of the world, connected across time and space by our shared curiosity about the past. The marriage of Isabella of Valois to Richard II was never intended to be a love story. It was a strategic triumph of medieval diplomacy, with Isabella serving as a pawn in a larger game to end one of the most devastating conflicts in European history: the 100 Years' War. To grasp Isabella's destiny, we need to understand the world she was born into and the forces shaping her short, tragic life. Isabella was born on November 9th, 1389, at the Louvre Palace in Paris, as the eldest daughter of one of medieval Europe's most troubled monarchs. Her father, King Charles VI of France, experienced episodes of madness, which must have been terrifying for the young princess. Known as Charles the Mad, her father's condition occasionally turned him from a competent ruler into a raving lunatic, forgetting his own identity, imagining he was made of glass, or refusing to bathe for months. Picture young Isabella's childhood in the luxurious but unstable French court. One day, her father might joyfully play with her, showering her with gifts and attention. The next, she might find him hiding in fear, screaming about imaginary assassins, or standing frozen, fearing his glass body would shatter. The palace staff would whisk the children away during these episodes, but the fear and confusion remained in Isabella's eyes. Her mother, Isabella of Bavaria, was a formidable woman, trying to keep the kingdom intact during her husband's incapacitated periods. Beautiful and intelligent, Isabella had her own political ambitions and knew her children were valuable assets in the complex European political landscape. She watched Isabella with a calculating eye, aware that her daughter's beauty and royal lineage would one day secure a vital alliance for France. The world Isabella entered was one of nearly constant warfare. For almost 60 years, England and France were locked in a brutal conflict that devastated both realms. The 100 Years' War began over English claims to the French throne, but evolved into a complex struggle for national identity, economic power, and territorial control, consuming generations. French villages lay in ruins from English raids, and English nobles had drained their resources financing campaigns across the Channel. Both kingdoms were exhausted, their treasuries depleted, and their people weary of war. By the 1390s, there were whispers of peace in both courts. But peace required more than words. It needed unbreakable bonds. This is where 6-year-old Isabella stepped onto the grand stage of European politics. The idea of marrying Isabella to Richard II first surfaced during secret negotiations between French and English ambassadors in 1395. Richard was devastated by the death of his beloved first wife, Anne of Bohemia, the previous year. Known as Good Queen Anne, she was adored by the English people for her kindness and charity. Her death from the plague left Richard grief-stricken and without an heir, a precarious situation for any medieval monarch. Richard's advisors urged him to remarry quickly, but he was initially resistant. His marriage to Anne had been one of genuine affection, rare among royal unions, and the idea of replacing her felt like a betrayal. However, duty to the realm ultimately outweighed personal feelings, and when French ambassadors arrived with a proposal that could end the war, Richard began to consider it. The French proposition was bold. They offered not only the king's eldest daughter's hand, but also a dowry of 800,000 francs, a vast sum that would help replenish England's war-depleted treasury. More importantly, they proposed a 28-year truce, long enough for a generation to grow up without war. There was one major obstacle. Isabella was only 6 years old, even by medieval standards. Most political marriages involved girls nearing adolescence, but the French negotiators argued that her youth was an advantage, symbolizing a fresh start, untainted by past conflicts. Isabella would be raised at the English court, learning English customs and loyalties. By the time she was old enough to serve as queen consort, she would be as much English as French. Richard's counselors were divided. Some saw the wisdom in the proposal. The dowry could fund the royal household for years, and the truce would allow England to focus on other threats, like Scotland's growing power and ongoing Irish rebellions. Others worried about the precedent of marrying a child so young, fearing it would scandalize even medieval nobility. But Richard was intrigued by something else. Court observers noted that when he saw Isabella's miniature portrait sent by the French ambassadors, his expression softened. Here was a child who needed protection, guidance, and care. Perhaps, some whispered, the childless king saw not just a political alliance, but also an opportunity to be a father as well as a husband. Negotiations stretched on for months, with ambassadors repeatedly crossing the Channel to finalize details. Every aspect of Isabella's future was debated and codified. She would keep her French servants and ladies-in-waiting and be allowed to practice French customs and maintain correspondence with her family. Crucially, all parties agreed that the marriage would not be consummated until she reached physical maturity, a safeguard explicitly written into the treaty. Meanwhile, in Paris, 6-year-old Isabella played with her dolls, unaware that her future was being decided in council chambers and documented with seals of wax and ribbon. Her tutors began teaching her English, and seamstresses started crafting a trousseau fit for a queen. She was told she would marry a great king across the sea, but at 6, the idea was as unreal to her as the fairy tales her nurses told at bedtime. The wedding ceremony occurred not once, but twice, mirroring the diplomatic complexity of the union. Isabella was only 7 when she married Richard II at the English-controlled port of Calais on October 31st, 1396. This first ceremony was intimate, attended mainly by negotiators and high-ranking nobles from both kingdoms. Calais, as English territory on French soil, provided neutral ground for this historic event. Standing in the Great Hall of Calais Castle, Isabella must have been overwhelmed by the significance of the moment. She wore a gown of cloth of gold, so heavily embroidered with pearls that she needed help walking. Her new husband knelt to her level to exchange rings, gently lifting her chin when she seemed frightened by the nobles staring at her. A year later, she was crowned queen at Westminster Abbey, with rumors of several people dying in the crush to catch a glimpse of the famous young bride. The English had heard tales of their new child queen, drawing massive crowds to London for the coronation. The ceremony was a spectacular display of royal pageantry, designed to show both English nobility and foreign observers that this unusual marriage had the crown's full support. Isabella paraded through London in a litter, decorated with English roses and French fleurs-de-lis, symbolizing the union of the two kingdoms. She wore a crown specially made for her small head, and her train was carried by English duchesses, chosen to serve as her guardians and teachers. The crowds lining the streets called blessings in English, which she was just beginning to understand, but she smiled and waved as instructed. The coronation feasts lasted 3 days, featuring entertainment like jugglers, musicians, and elaborate theatrical presentations depicting the glorious future this marriage promised both kingdoms. Isabella sat at the high table beside Richard, picking at her food, with the careful manners her French tutors had instilled, while nobles toasted the child queen's health. But even as celebrations continued, experienced courtiers were already questioning how long this peace would last. Medieval truces, no matter how elaborately negotiated, were fragile. Richard II, although powerful, wasn't universally loved by his nobles. Many whispered discontent, especially those who believed the king was too swayed by his favorites and too eager for peace with France, even when England's military position was strong. For now, however, Isabella was safe in her new home. Richard set her up in her own apartments at Westminster Palace, with a carefully selected household blending French and English attendants. Her days were filled with lessons, not only in languages and courtly skills, but also in the complex etiquette of English court life. She learned to curtsy the English way, to prefer wine over ale at meals, and to speak English with the court's accent rather than her French tutors. Richard himself was actively involved in her education and well-being. Chronicles from the time describe him visiting her apartments regularly, bringing her gifts from across his realm, like exotic birds from Ireland, fine books from Oxford, and musical instruments made by London's best artisans. He seemed to genuinely enjoy her company, and she began to look forward to his visits, greeting him with a mix of formality and affection that defined their unique relationship. The other children at court quickly accepted Isabella as one of their own. Medieval royal households often included many young nobles, raised and educated, alongside the monarch's family. Isabella found particular friendship with the daughters of Richard's supporters, girls her own age, who helped her navigate the subtle hierarchies and unspoken rules of English noble society. Her favorite companion was Margaret Holland, daughter of one of Richard's half-brothers. Margaret was just 2 years older than Isabella, but seemed worldly and sophisticated to the young queen. It was Margaret who taught Isabella English children's games, helped her understand which ladies-in-waiting could be trusted with secrets, and warned her about the political undercurrents that even children couldn't entirely escape. The two girls spent hours in Isabella's private garden, practicing needlework, while Margaret explained the genealogies of English noble houses and the ancient feuds simmering beneath the surface of court politeness. Isabella was a quick learner, and her French perspective on English politics often offered insights that surprised her older companions. Once, Isabella asked Margaret why English nobles seemed to watch each other so closely. In France, there were factions and quarrels, but in England, everyone seemed to be waiting for something to happen. Margaret, wise beyond her years, explained that Richard's reign had been marked by conflicts with his nobles almost from the start. There had been a major rebellion when he was young, and he had never fully forgiven those who opposed him. Meanwhile, many of the influential lords believed Richard was overly attached to his court favorites and too willing to disregard their advice on war and governance. "The king is powerful now," Margaret said, "but power in England must be shared with the nobles. Your marriage helps him because it brings peace with France. But some see it as a sign of weakness, preferring negotiation to conquest." Isabella absorbed these lessons with the seriousness of a child beginning to understand her life was tied to forces much larger than herself. She started observing court interactions with a fresh perspective, noticing how certain nobles would fall silent when Richard entered a room, how conversations shifted when she appeared, and how even her French ladies-in-waiting chose their words carefully on political matters. The years 1397 and 1398 were peaceful for Isabella. She grew from a tiny child into a more confident girl, becoming fluent in English and gaining a sophisticated understanding of court life. Richard continued to treat her with paternal kindness, and she began to feel genuinely at home in England. The massive stone walls of Westminster became familiar rather than intimidating, and she could navigate the complex maze of corridors and chambers without getting lost. Her education expanded beyond typical feminine accomplishments, like needlework and music. Richard insisted she learn to read and write in both French and English, with tutors among the kingdom's finest scholars. She studied history, particularly the chronicles of English and French kings, learning about the great figures who shaped her world. One of her favorite lessons involved maps. Her tutor, Master William, would spread large parchments across her study chamber floor, showing her the extent of both kingdoms and explaining how geography influenced centuries of conflict. Isabella would kneel beside these maps, tracing coastlines with her finger, imagining the ships carrying armies and ambassadors across the channel. "See here, Your Grace," Master William would say, pointing to the narrow waters between Dover and Calais. "This small strip of water has been both a bridge and a barrier between our peoples. Your marriage represents the hope it might finally serve only as a bridge." Isabella nodded solemnly, understanding even at 8 years old she embodied something larger than herself. She was not just a girl learning to be a queen. She was a living symbol of peace between two nations that had been enemies for longer than anyone could remember. But symbols, as Isabella was about to learn, could be fragile in the violent world of medieval politics. The first signs of trouble came in early 1399, when Isabella noticed changes in the atmosphere at court. Conversations stopped more abruptly when she appeared. Her ladies-in-waiting exchanged worried glances when they thought she wasn't watching. Even Margaret Holland appeared distracted and anxious, though she tried to keep their routines normal. Richard himself seemed different. His visits to Isabella's apartments became less frequent, and when he did visit, he appeared preoccupied, often gazing out the windows toward the Thames as if expecting ships on the horizon. His usual gifts of books and trinkets stopped, and Isabella began to wonder if she had upset him in some way. The truth was far more serious than a child's misstep. Richard was facing the greatest crisis of his reign, unrelated to his young queen. His cousin Henry Bolingbroke, whom Richard had exiled the previous year, had returned to England with an army, claiming he only wanted to reclaim his inheritance, but clearly intending much more. Many English nobles, long unhappy under Richard's rule, began to support Henry. The stability that had allowed Isabella to feel safe at the English court was crumbling rapidly. Isabella first realized the severity of the situation when she awoke one morning to find several of her English ladies-in-waiting had vanished overnight. When she asked her French attendants where they had gone, she received evasive answers. By afternoon, she heard shouting from the courtyard below her windows, and when she looked out, she saw armed men in unfamiliar livery. That evening, Margaret Holland rushed into Isabella's chambers, her face pale with fear. "You must pack immediately," she whispered urgently. "Only the essentials. We're leaving Westminster tonight." "Where are we going?" Isabella asked, her heart racing with panic she hadn't felt since her early days in England. "To the Tower," Margaret replied. "The king says it's for your safety." She didn't finish the sentence, but Isabella understood. The Tower of London was both palace and prison, and in political upheaval, the distinction often became meaningless. The journey through London's dark streets was unlike anything Isabella had experienced before. Instead of the ceremonial processions she was used to, they traveled in a small, heavily guarded convoy, with armed men riding before and behind her litter. The curtains were drawn, but she could hear the city's sounds around them, not the usual noise of commerce and daily life, but something more urgent and threatening. At the Tower, Isabella was placed in apartments that were comfortable, but clearly meant to contain, rather than just house her. The windows were barred, and guards stood at every entrance. Her French ladies-in-waiting were allowed to stay with her, but most of her English attendants were dismissed. For the first time since arriving in England, Isabella felt truly isolated. On her second day at the Tower, Richard came to see Isabella, and the change in him was startling. The confident, kind king she once knew had vanished, replaced by a man who seemed to have aged years in mere weeks. His clothes were disheveled, his hair unkempt, and his eyes carried a wildness that reminded Isabella uncomfortably of her father's bouts of madness. "My dear child," he said, kneeling before her chair as he had during their first meeting. "Our circumstances have become difficult. There are those who question my right to rule and seek to overturn the peace we've built with your father's kingdom." Isabella, now 9 and far more mature than she had been 3 years earlier, grasped the implications. "Are you still king?" she asked bluntly. Richard's smile was bitter. "For now," he replied, "but Henry Bolingbroke has many supporters, and I may not be able to protect you as I once could." Their conversation was unlike any before. For the first time, Richard spoke to Isabella not as a child to be sheltered, but as a political equal who needed to understand her situation. He explained that Henry was claiming the throne, that many great nobles had abandoned Richard, and that the future of both England and peace with France was precarious. "What will happen to me?" Isabella asked, showing a composure remarkable for anyone, let alone a 9-year-old girl. "I don't know," Richard admitted, and Isabella saw this uncertainty tormented him. "Henry may use you as a bargaining chip with your father, or he may honor our marriage and continue to protect you. Much depends on whether he values peace with France over his own ambitions." This was Isabella's first real lesson in the harsh realities of medieval politics. Her worth as a person was secondary to her value as a symbol and diplomatic asset. The love and care Richard had shown, genuine as they were, couldn't shield her from the larger forces reshaping England. The following weeks passed in agonizing uncertainty. Isabella could hear the city beyond the Tower walls, yet she was cut off from reliable news. Her French ladies whispered among themselves, but even they seemed to know little beyond rumors. Finally, on a gray October morning, Isabella heard the sound she dreaded, the heavy footsteps of armed men approaching her chambers. When the doors opened, she saw not the familiar guards, but new men wearing the red rose livery of Henry Bolingbroke. The man who entered behind them was tall and imposing, with the bearing of a soldier and the calculating eyes of a politician. This was Henry himself. Henry IV of England arrived to meet Isabella, a child who symbolized both an opportunity and a challenge for his new reign. Isabella rose from her chair and offered a deep curtsy, as she had been instructed to do when meeting a king. Henry observed her for a long moment, noting her composure and apparent intelligence, perhaps considering how she could be useful to him. "Your Grace," he addressed her formally, and Isabella noticed he still acknowledged her royal title. "I regret that circumstances require us to discuss your future under these conditions." "What has become of the king?" Isabella asked, directly referring to Richard, a trait that had become characteristic of her. "Richard of Bordeaux is no longer king," Henry replied, using Richard's birth name instead of his royal title. "He has abdicated in favor of my claim to the throne." Isabella, aware of political nuances, understood that abdicated likely meant he was forced to relinquish the crown, but she didn't challenge the euphemism. Instead, she asked the question most crucial to her immediate future. "What becomes of me?" Henry's response would determine whether Isabella remained a queen or became a valuable prisoner. Her fate depended on the new king's strategy regarding the peace treaty with France, whether to maintain it or risk war for other political aims. "That," Henry said, "depends on many factors. Your father's reaction to recent events, my advisor's counsel, and perhaps most importantly, your own actions in the coming months." With those words, 9-year-old Isabella entered the most precarious period of her young life. The protective bubble of Richard's court was gone, replaced by the harsh realities of a kingdom in transition. She was no longer just a child queen being groomed for her royal duties. She was a political prisoner, whose worth might be weighed against the costs of war or peace. The weeks following Richard's deposition were a lesson in survival for Isabella. Confined to the tower, but not yet formally imprisoned, she navigated the dangerous dynamics of a court still deciding her fate. Some of Henry's supporters argued for sending her back to France immediately to avoid the expense of maintaining her household and to show England's readiness to renegotiate the peace treaty from a strong position. Others advised caution, noting that Isabella's presence provided England with leverage in future negotiations with France. As long as she was in English custody, her father would hesitate to take actions that might jeopardize her safety. This group argued she should be kept comfortable but closely watched. Isabella herself played her role with remarkable skill for such a young girl, remaining unfailingly polite to her captors and careful not to offend or appear to plot against Henry's government. Meanwhile, she upheld the dignity befitting her status, insisting on being treated as the queen she legally still was. Her French ladies-in-waiting were invaluable during this time. Unlike her dismissed or fled English attendants, these women remained loyal to Isabella rather than any English faction. They helped her grasp the complexities of her situation and coached her on maintaining the delicate balance required. Her chief lady-in-waiting, Madame de Cousset, reminded her, "You are still Queen of England, in the eyes of the law and your father's court. Henry may wear the crown, but he hasn't dared to dissolve your marriage or formally reject the treaty. As long as that holds, you have value, and where there is value, there is hope." However, this hope came with a heavy cost that Isabella was just beginning to grasp. Rumors started to reach the tower about Richard's fate. First came whispers of his death in captivity at Pontefract Castle, followed by hints that his death wasn't natural, suggesting Henry's supporters may have orchestrated an accident. When Isabella finally confirmed Richard's death, the news struck her with unexpected impact. She had never loved Richard as a wife, loves a husband being still a child, How could she? But he had been kind to her, protected her, and was the closest thing to a father figure since she left France. His death was not just a personal loss, but also the severing of her last link to the life she had built in England. The nature of Richard's death also carried dark implications for her own future. If Henry could arrange the murder of a king, what would stop him from disposing of a French princess who was no longer useful? These fears were confirmed when, in early 1400, Isabella received an ultimatum from Henry's government. She could return to France, but only if she formally recognized Henry as the rightful king of England, and renounced any claims to the English throne as Richard's widow. The proposed agreement was a diplomatic triumph from Henry's viewpoint. By leaving England voluntarily, Isabella would implicitly accept that her marriage to Richard was nullified by his deposition, freeing Henry from the original peace treaty's obligations and avoiding the complications of forcibly expelling a child queen. For Isabella, the choice was harsh: accept exile and admit her 3 years as Queen of England were meaningless, or refuse and risk indefinite imprisonment. At just 10 years old, she faced a decision impacting not only her future, but also the relationship between England and France for years to come. Her French advisors were divided. Some suggested she should accept the terms and return to her father's court, where she could be properly cared for and perhaps find a new marriage. Others insisted she should refuse, asserting she remained Richard's legitimate widow and England's rightful queen despite Henry's usurpation. Isabella herself grappled with the decision for weeks. Part of her longed to return to France to see her family and escape the uncertainty of Henry's court, but another part recognized that accepting Henry's terms would betray Richard's memory and abandon the peace he died trying to preserve. In the end, events beyond her control made the decision for her. During a lucid period, Charles VI sent word that he expected his daughter to return to France immediately. The message, delivered through diplomatic channels, made clear that continued negotiations over Isabella's status would be seen as hostility by the French crown. Faced with the prospect of renewed war with France, Henry's government quickly agreed to Isabella's departure. The terms of her release were kept vague, allowing both sides to interpret her return as either voluntary or forced, depending on political needs. The journey back to France in the summer of 1401 was bittersweet for Isabella. She was leaving behind the home she had known for 5 years, the apartments where she learned to read English poetry, the gardens where she played with Margaret Holland, and the Great Hall where she was crowned Queen of England. At the same time, she was returning to a family and country that had become foreign during her years in England. She now spoke French with a slight English accent, preferred English fashions, and had to relearn her father's court etiquette. The little girl who left Paris at 6 returned as a young woman of 11, shaped by experiences her French relatives couldn't fully understand. The reunion with her parents was complicated by her father's deteriorating mental state. Charles VI was amid one of his worst episodes when Isabella arrived, convinced he was pursued by invisible enemies and refusing to recognize his family. When he emerged from his madness weeks later, he seemed confused by Isabella's presence, as if forgetting she had been married to the English king. Her mother, Isabella, was more welcoming, but also calculating. The Queen of France immediately considered how Isabella's unique position could advance French interests. As the widow of an English king, Isabella held a diplomatic status that could be valuable in future negotiations. Her time at the English court made Isabella a valuable source of intelligence on English politics and military capabilities. She was torn between these demands on her loyalty and knowledge. Born in France but once Queen of England, she felt some lingering duty to the nation that had been her home. When her mother's advisors asked about English defenses or Henry's support among the nobility, she offered general insights, carefully avoiding details that could aid military plans. The months after her return to France were a time for adjustment and reflection. No longer a child, but not yet fully an adult, at 11 she had faced more political turmoil and personal loss than most experience in a lifetime. The question was what role she would play in medieval European politics. Her status as a former queen made her an attractive marriage prospect, but it complicated potential matches. Some suitors were intimidated by her royal status and political significance, while others sought political advantages more than her. Isabella, having strong opinions about marriage from her experience with Richard, knew political marriages could provide protection, but could also collapse quickly if circumstances changed. Any future husband needed to understand she was not merely a diplomatic asset, but a young woman with her own intelligence, preferences, and ambitions. The French court of 1401 was dangerous for someone with Isabella's complex loyalties. The ongoing war with England meant high anti-English sentiment, and her past as queen made some courtiers suspicious. She had to be cautious not to seem too sympathetic to English interests, while not betraying her genuine affection for Richard and his supporters. Meanwhile, her father's mental instability left the French government in the hands of competing noble factions. Isabella had to navigate these disputes without becoming a pawn for any group. Her mother, Isabeau, was both protector and potential threat. The Queen of France genuinely cared for Isabella's welfare, but was also a savvy political operator who saw her daughter's experiences and connections as valuable to the crown. Isabeau's protection came with the expectation that Isabella would serve French interests, even when they conflicted with her own preferences or morals. In 1402, new complications arose when Isabella learned that Henry IV was facing major rebellions in England. The Percy family, once his supporters, had turned against him, and there were also uprisings in Wales and Scotland. Some at the French court saw this as a chance to invade England and restore the rightful dynasty, possibly involving Isabella as a symbolic figure due to her status as the widow of the last Plantagenet king. Isabella was horrified by these discussions. She had no desire to see England torn apart by civil war, despite her feelings about Henry's usurpation. The English people she knew, her servants, tutors, and childhood companions, were innocent of their ruler's political crimes. The thought of French armies ravaging English villages in her name deeply disturbed her. When asked for her opinion on potential military action against England, Isabella chose her words carefully. She highlighted that an invasion would likely cause massive casualties on both sides, that the English might rally to defend their homeland, despite their feelings about Henry, and that success was uncertain given England's natural defenses and military traditions. Her reluctance to support anti-English action drew criticism from French hawks, who accused her of divided loyalties. However, her position was supported by more moderate voices at court, who argued peaceful relations with England served French interests better than renewed warfare. These political tensions peaked in 1403 when Isabella was approached by representatives of Charles, Duke of Orléans, with a marriage proposal that would dramatically change her life again. The Duke of Orléans was her cousin, the son of her father's brother, and a powerful noble in France. At 29, he was the same age Richard had been when he married Isabella. But now, the age gap seemed less significant, as Isabella was approaching 14. The proposed marriage was appealing for several reasons. It would keep Isabella within the French royal family, preventing her from becoming a diplomatic asset for a foreign power, and align her with one of Europe's most cultured and sophisticated courts, as the Duke was a patron of the arts and a capable military leader. For Isabella, the match offered the prospect of a marriage based on mutual respect rather than pure political calculation. She had met her cousin several times during her childhood, and he had always treated her with courtesy and kindness. More importantly, he was mature and experienced enough to be a genuine partner, rather than just another guardian figure. The negotiations for this marriage occurred amidst ongoing turmoil in England and growing French confidence that Henry IV's reign might not withstand its early challenges. If Henry fell, there was a chance Isabella could be brought back to England to legitimize a new regime. This potential complication made the timing of Isabella's remarriage crucial from a French viewpoint. Charles of Orléans understood the sensitive nature of the situation. He wasn't just looking for a wife, he was potentially aligning himself with a woman who might be called upon to play a role in English politics. This added a layer of complexity to their courtship that was unusual, even by medieval noble marriage standards. When Isabella first met with Charles to seriously discuss the marriage, she was struck by how different he was from Richard. Where Richard had been gentle and somewhat otherworldly, Charles was passionate and deeply engaged with the world around him. He spoke to her not as a child to be protected, but as an equal whose opinions and experiences mattered. "I want you to understand," he told her, during one of their private conversations, "that I am not seeking to marry the former Queen of England. I am seeking to marry Isabella of Valois, the remarkable young woman who survived the courts of 2 kingdoms and emerged with her dignity intact." Isabella found herself genuinely attracted to Charles in a way she had never experienced before. At 14, she was no longer a child, and the feelings stirring within her were those of a young woman discovering her own desires and preferences. Charles was handsome, cultured, and intelligent, but more importantly, he seemed to see her as an individual rather than just a political asset. The marriage negotiations moved swiftly once both parties agreed to the basic terms. Isabella would bring her status as a former queen and her valuable political connections, while Charles would offer her a secure position in French society and protection from those who might seek to use her for their own purposes. The wedding took place in June 1406 at the Cathedral of Notre Dame in Paris, a ceremony deliberately contrasting Isabella's first marriage, where her wedding to Richard had been a small diplomatic affair. This celebration was a grand spectacle designed to showcase the power and prosperity of the French royal house. Isabella, now 16, wore a gown of deep blue silk embroidered with golden fleur-de-lis, her dark hair crowned with a circlet of sapphires and pearls. She walked down the aisle of the great cathedral with confidence, no longer the frightened child married to a stranger, but a young woman choosing her own path. Charles stood at the altar in his finest robes, his face radiating genuine happiness rather than just diplomatic satisfaction. When they exchanged vows, their voices were clear and strong, and observers noted that they looked directly at each other, truly engaged rather than simply fulfilling a political obligation. The wedding feast that followed celebrated French culture and power. Troubadours sang ballads in honor of the couple. Elaborate performances depicted love triumphing over adversity, and the finest wines from the realm flowed freely. Isabella found herself relaxing and enjoying the festivities in a way she had never been able to in England. More importantly, for the first time since leaving France as a child, she felt she truly belonged. The French court welcomed her back, not as a failed political experiment, but as a valued royal family member who had gained wisdom and experience from her trials. The early years of Isabella's marriage to Charles were among the happiest of her life. Charles proved to be not only a devoted husband, but also an intellectual companion who shared her interests in literature, music, and the arts. His court at Blois became a center of cultural refinement, attracting poets, scholars, and artists from across Europe. Isabella embraced her new role with enthusiasm. She supported troubadours, commissioned illuminated manuscripts, established a scriptorium where monks preserved important texts, and maintained correspondence with scholars throughout Europe. Her experiences in England gave her a unique perspective on European culture, and she used this to foster intellectual exchange between French and foreign courts. she also began developing her own political voice. Charles valued her insights into English affairs, but more importantly, he respected her judgment on broader issues affecting their duchy and the kingdom. Isabella became a true partner in governance, not just a decorative consort. The couple's first child, a daughter named Jeanne, was born in 1407. Isabella approached motherhood with the same intensity she brought to everything else, determined to be a more present parent than her own mother, who had been hindered by the chaos of her father's reign. She insisted on nursing her baby herself, despite court physicians' protests that it was beneath a duchess's dignity. Holding her daughter for the first time, Isabella felt a profound sense of fulfillment. This child would grow up knowing her parents' love and protection, free from the political machinations that shaped Isabella's own childhood. She whispered promises to the sleeping infant in both French and English, vowing that Jeanne would have choices Isabella had never been given. The birth of their daughter strengthened the bond between Isabella and Charles. He was a devoted father, spending time with Jeanne despite his political and military duties. Isabella often found him in the nursery, reading to their daughter, or simply watching her sleep, marveling at the miracle they had created together. Yet, even as Isabella enjoyed domestic happiness, the outside world intruded. News from England remained troubling, with Henry IV facing ongoing rebellions and challenges to his authority. More immediately threatening was the rising tension within France itself, as the king's mental illness created a power vacuum that various noble factions eagerly sought to fill. Isabella's father-in-law, Louis of Orléans, was among the most ambitious. As the king's brother, he claimed the right to govern during Charles VI's periods of incapacity. But this claim was contested by the Duke of Burgundy, who had his own supporters and vision for France's future. The rivalry between the Orléans and Burgundian factions would eventually tear France apart. But in the early years of Isabella's marriage, it seemed like just another political dispute swirling around the royal court. Isabella tried to stay above these factional conflicts, focusing on her family and cultural pursuits while leaving the political maneuvering to others. This neutrality became impossible to maintain in November 1407. When Louis of Orléans was assassinated in Paris by agents of the Duke of Burgundy, the murder was brazen, carried out in broad daylight before the killers vanished into Paris's medieval streets. The assassination transformed Isabella's life overnight. Charles, who inherited his father's titles and responsibilities, was now among the most powerful men in France, but also a marked man. The Duke of Burgundy had shown his willingness to use violence against enemies, and the Orléans family was now his primary target. Isabella found herself thrust into a world of bodyguards and constant vigilance. Her movements were restricted for security, and her correspondence was monitored to ensure no information about her family's activities fell into enemy hands. The carefree atmosphere of their court at Blois was replaced by the grim reality of civil war. Charles himself was changed by his father's murder. The cultured, artistic young man Isabella had married began to show a harder edge, driven by a desire for vengeance that sometimes frightened her. He began to gather allies and resources for what everyone knew would be a long and bloody conflict with the Burgundian faction. Isabella supported her husband's cause, but worried about the cost of the coming war. She had witnessed how political violence could ruin lives and kingdoms, and she feared that France might suffer the same fate as England during the Wars of the Roses. Her fears were realized as the conflict between the Orléans and Burgundian factions turned into open warfare. The birth of Isabella's second child, a son named Charles in 1408, offered a brief break from the political tensions. The arrival of a male heir strengthened the Orléans' claim to leadership in France, but it also made Isabella's family a more appealing target for their enemies. Isabella was even more attentive to her son's upbringing than she had been with John. She was determined that Charles would appreciate both the privileges and responsibilities of his noble birth, while also developing the character needed to navigate the treacherous world of medieval politics without losing his humanity. She insisted on being involved in every facet of his education, from selecting tutors to designing his curriculum. Drawing on her experiences at the English court, she ensured her son learned multiple languages, studied the histories of European kingdoms, and acquired the diplomatic skills essential for his future role. The early years of the Civil War were marked by battles and sieges that wore down both sides. Isabella managed the family's territories, while Charles campaigned, a role requiring mastery of medieval warfare logistics and governance. She excelled in these tasks, using her diplomatic skills to maintain alliances and her organizational talents to ensure supplies and reinforcements reached Charles's forces as needed. Her letters from this period reveal a woman who had embraced her role as a political leader, no longer the confused child shuffled between courts, but a mature woman in control of her destiny. The war devastated France. Entire regions were ravaged by competing armies, trade was disrupted, and common people suffered from the soldiers' depredations. Isabella used her position to provide relief, establishing charitable foundations and negotiating safe passage for refugees fleeing the worst of the fighting. Her efforts to aid war victims enhanced her reputation in France. She became known not just as the Duchess of Orleans, but as a compassionate leader, mindful of her obligations to the common people. This reputation would prove valuable as the political situation in France grew more complex. The birth of Isabella's third child, a daughter named Margarita in 1409, was both a joy and a source of anxiety. Isabella was now 20, and the frequent pregnancies were taking a toll on her health. Medieval medicine offered little understanding of maternal mortality, but Isabella was wise enough to recognize the risks she faced with each childbirth. She approached this pregnancy with extra care, following the advice of the best physicians available and preparing detailed instructions for her children's care in case something happened to her. These preparations proved to be foresighted, as complications during Marguerite's birth nearly cost Isabella her life. For several days after the delivery, Isabella teetered between life and death, weakened by blood loss and infection. Charles rarely left her side, and messengers were dispatched across Europe to pray for her recovery. The possibility of her death forced both Isabella and Charles to confront the fragility of their happiness and the uncertain future their children faced. Isabella's recovery was slow and incomplete. The birth had damaged her health in ways that would affect her for the rest of her life, leaving her vulnerable to various illnesses common in medieval times. More immediately, her physicians warned that another pregnancy would likely kill her, advice that profoundly affected her relationship with Charles. Their physical intimacy became cautious and constrained, overshadowed by the fear of conception. This change was difficult for both of them, but especially for Isabella, who had found great joy in the physical expression of their love. The passionate young woman who had discovered her own desires was now forced to suppress them for survival. Despite these challenges, Isabella and Charles's marriage remained strong. They found new ways to express their love and partnership, focusing on shared interests in culture and politics. Isabella became even more involved in governing their territories, effectively serving as Charles's co-ruler while he campaigned against the Burgundians. In 1410, new complications arose when the Duke of Burgundy began negotiating with the English, seeking to involve Henry IV in the French Civil War on the Burgundian side. Isabella was horrified at the prospect of English intervention, fearing France would face the same devastation as during the 100 Years' War. She used her unique position as a former Queen of England to open back-channel communications with the English court. Through intermediaries, she tried to persuade Henry IV that intervening in the French Civil War would be costly and ultimately futile. Her efforts were hindered by lingering suspicion in England, but she persisted in trying to prevent the resumption of large-scale warfare between the two kingdoms. These diplomatic efforts showcased Isabella's growing sophistication as a political operator. She realized her worth was not solely in her royal ties, but in her ability to grasp the broader patterns of European politics and devise strategies that served multiple interests. Her diplomatic successes boosted her reputation in France and beyond. She was consulted not only on issues affecting her husband's territories, but also on wider French policy matters. Her opinions were valued due to her unique experiences and proven skill in navigating complex political situations. Isabella's health continued to decline throughout 1411 and 1412. The aftermath of Marguerite's birth left her susceptible to respiratory infections, and she experienced chronic fatigue, making daily activities increasingly difficult. She spent more time in reflection and prayer, perhaps aware that her time was limited. Despite her physical frailties, Isabella remained mentally sharp and emotionally involved with her family and duties. She continued to oversee her children's education, manage the family's political affairs, and pursue her cultural interests. Her determination to live fully, despite her health issues, inspired those around her. The spring of 1409 brought a brief hope when initial peace talks began between the Orlean and Burgundian factions. Isabella played a crucial role in these talks, using her diplomatic skills and reputation for fairness to help bridge the gap. Although the negotiations ultimately failed, Isabella's efforts were praised, enhancing her standing as a potential mediator in future conflicts. Her ability to work with representatives from both factions showed her political maturity and commitment to peaceful solutions for France's problems. As 1409 progressed, Isabella's health declined more severely. Her chronic respiratory problems worsened, and she began suffering from the wasting disease that would eventually claim her life. Medieval physicians did not understand the tuberculosis, likely killing her, but recognized her grave condition. Isabella faced the prospect of death with the same courage she had shown throughout her life. She made careful arrangements for her children's future, ensuring they would be protected and educated regardless of her fate. She also worked to secure her husband's political faction, aware her death might create opportunities for their enemies. Her final months were spent preparing for death and cherishing time with her family. She insisted on maintaining her daily activities as long as possible, determined not to become a burden to her loved ones. Her bravery in facing terminal illness became legendary, inspiring stories and songs for generations. Isabella of Valois died on September 13, 1409, at just 20 years old. Her life spanned 3 kingdoms and 2 marriages, experiencing both the heights of royal power and depths of political uncertainty. Her death was mourned across Europe, not only by her family and subjects, but also by many she touched with her kindness and wisdom. The funeral procession to her final resting place at the Celestine Convent in Paris was among the largest in medieval France. Representatives from all over Europe came to honor a woman who embodied the complex interactions between personal courage and political necessity of her time. Charles of Orleans was devastated by his wife's death, losing not just a beloved spouse, but a trusted advisor and political partner whose insights were crucial to his success. Though he eventually remarried, he never forgot Isabella or the happiness they shared in their brief time together. Isabella's children played significant roles in French and European history. Her son Charles became a noted poet and patron of the arts, while her daughters made advantageous marriages that strengthened the Orleans family's position. They carried forward their mother's values, courage, compassion, and a commitment to using their privileges to serve others. The political consequences of Isabella's death were felt across France and beyond. Her absence removed a moderating influence from the Civil War, intensifying the conflict between the Orleans and Burgundian factions. The peace she worked hard to achieve remained elusive, and France continued to suffer from internal divisions for years. However, Isabella's legacy went beyond the immediate political consequences. She showed that even when women were expected to be passive political assets, a determined individual could carve out a space for independent action and moral leadership. Her life became an inspiration for other women facing similar challenges. Isabella's courage and intelligence were cited by later generations of female rulers and political actors seeking to expand the boundaries of what was possible for women in public life. Modern historians sometimes struggle to understand Isabella's story, caught between admiration for her personal achievements and discomfort with the circumstances that shaped her life. The marriage of a 6-year-old child to a 29-year-old man clashes with our modern views on childhood and consent, despite the political reasons behind such arrangements. However, judging Isabella's world by today's standards overlooks the deep humanity in her story. She was born into a system where royal children were diplomatic assets, yet she rose above these constraints to lead a life of true meaning and accomplishment. Her marriages, regardless of their origins, evolved into partnerships of mutual respect and affection. The violence and political instability of her time were not moral failings, but a result of a world where personal security and political legitimacy were always in question. Isabella's ability to navigate these challenges while maintaining her integrity and compassion highlights the enduring human capacity for growth and moral courage. Her story reminds us that history is not just about grand military movements and the rise and fall of kingdoms, but about the individuals who lived through these events and shaped them through their choices. Isabella of Valois chose to be more than a victim of circumstances, creating a legacy that transcends the political arrangements of her era. Looking back, we see in Isabella's life both the limitations and possibilities that have always defined human existence. She was restricted by her era's expectations of age and gender, yet she found ways to assert her agency and contribute meaningfully to the world. Her story is one of resilience, intelligence, and the belief that personal happiness and political responsibility can coexist. The medieval world that produced Isabella of Valois was harsh and unforgiving in ways we can scarcely imagine. Life was short, childhood brief, and political alliances often sealed with human lives. Yet within these constraints, people like Isabella found ways to create beauty, show kindness, and build relationships that brought meaning to their lives. Her legacy is not one of victimhood, but of triumph over circumstances that might have crushed a lesser spirit. Ultimately, Isabella's story reminds us that every age has its own moral complexities, and that people of the past, despite their different world, shared our fundamental human needs for love, security, and purpose.